The world watched Alaska with a mix of hope and anxiety. On a cold August weekend, American and Russian leaders met face to face on U.S. soil for the first time in years, with one question hanging over everything: would there be a ceasefire in Ukraine, or was this only political theater? The meeting ended without a ceasefire. But what actually happened, and why did it matter so much? Today, I will guide you, step by step, through the whole story, so that even if you knew nothing about this meeting 5 minutes ago, you will understand exactly what it was, what it meant, and what comes next. Let's begin with the build-up. In the days before the summit, former President Donald Trump, now again at the center of U.S. decision-making, publicly shaped expectations. He said he wanted peace in Ukraine but signaled that a ceasefire alone might not be enough. He pushed the idea of moving straight to a broader peace agreement and hinted that both sides would have to make concessions. At the same time, he sent strong messages to other countries, especially India, suggesting that the United States could use tariffs and secondary sanctions to pressure Russia's partners and buyers of Russian oil. This was not quiet diplomacy, it was loud, public positioning, and it set a tough tone before anyone even landed in Alaska. Why Alaska? The location was symbolic and practical. Alaska sits between the Russian Far East and the American mainland, and it allowed a high-security, military-based venue away from Washington's politics. It also let the White House host a meeting with a Russian leader who still faces an ICC arrest warrant without the complications that might arise in other jurisdictions. The choice of Alaska, with its Cold War echoes and Russian historical ties, gave the event a stage filled with meaning. This was a meeting about war and peace, but also about power, image, and history. Before the talks even started, Russia signaled its mindset in a striking way. As the delegations arrived, Russia's veteran foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, was seen wearing a sweatshirt emblazoned with the Cyrillic letters, the old Soviet USSR. It was not an accident. It was a visual message, a piece of theater. Western media read it as trolling, an intentional nod to Soviet-era power and a reminder of Moscow's hardened posture since 2022. Clothing isn't policy, but in diplomacy it can be messaging. Lavrov's choice told the world that Russia came to Alaska with swagger, nostalgia, and a willingness to provoke. That costume choice framed the atmosphere even before the first handshake. Protests formed outside. Ukrainian flags, pro-Kiev signs, and anti-war crowds met the motorcades. Inside the venue, the optics were carefully choreographed: arrivals, honor guards, a tight schedule. Then the doors closed. For more than 2.5 hours, the leaders and their team spoke in a secure room about the future of a war that has reshaped global security. When they emerged, there were no signed papers, no dramatic announcements of ceasefire starts at midnight, no troop pullbacks, no prisoner exchange lists. It was a summit without a concrete deal. So, what exactly came out? First, and most important, no ceasefire. Despite hopes for at least a short pause in fighting, the two leaders did not declare one. Instead, Trump publicly shifted from his earlier emphasis on securing a ceasefire to talking up a broader peace deal, a long process that would, in theory, include Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. That shift moved the U.S. position closer to Russia's long-standing line: talk peace in general terms, but do not freeze the front lines immediately. Analysts called this a diplomatic win for Putin because it buys time for Russia on the battlefield while keeping pressure off Moscow in the short term. Second, Trump told Zelensky after the meeting that Putin actually wants more of Ukraine, and that any peace would still require negotiations with Kiev. In other words, even as the US leader floated a peace framework without a prior ceasefire, he acknowledged that Russia had not softened its goals. No map was redrawn in Alaska. No territory was traded for peace. The war continued, and the front lines stayed hot. Third, the economic pressure track stayed alive, but with mixed signals. Trump hinted at tougher penalties on Russia's economy and even secondary sanctions on countries that help finance Moscow through energy purchases. He also dangled decisions on possible penalties for China. Yet in the same breath, U.S. officials did not announce new sanctions that day, and Russian media spun the meeting as a comeback moment for Putin. The lack of immediate action, combined with the shift away from a ceasefire, made observers wonder if Moscow had gained valuable time, at least in the short run. Now we have to talk about the India angle, because it shaped the diplomacy before the summit. In the run-up to Alaska, Trump claimed that Russia had lost India as an oil client, linking that claim to tariff moves against Indian goods and the threat of secondary sanctions targeting buyers of Russian oil. This was a sharp warning shot. It was designed to push New Delhi away from Moscow and to show Putin that America still had economic levers. Whether the claim was fully accurate was less important than the signal it sent. Washington was willing to use trade weapons to influence the geopolitics of the war. That is how the meeting began, under a cloud of tariff threats and energy diplomacy. How did India answer? New Delhi's response was firm and measured. India welcomed the fact that the US and Russia were talking in Alaska, calling dialogue and diplomacy the only real path to end the war. At the same time, India pushed back hard on unilateral tariff threats. The Ministry of External Affairs described such moves as unfair and unjustified and made it clear that India will take all steps necessary to protect its national interests, especially its energy security. India's consistent line has been simple: our people need affordable energy, and we will buy from where the best offer exists. That balance, supporting peace talks while defending national interests, was India's message to both Washington and Moscow during the summit weekend. Let's return inside the summit room. What did Putin want, and did he get it? Analysts say the Kremlin's goals were threefold. First, to restore Putin's image as a global player who can stand beside an American president, despite Western isolation and an ICC warrant. Second, to shift the US conversation away from immediate ceasefire demands and toward longer, slower talks. Third, to probe for sanctions relief or at least to stop new measures from landing right away. On those points, Putin did not get everything, but he did get something. The optics were strong for him, the narrative shifted away from a quick ceasefire, and there was no instant economic punishment announced. For a leader fighting a grinding war, time and optics are assets. Did Trump fail? That depends on how you define success. If success means a ceasefire announcement on stage, then yes, the summit failed to deliver. If success means starting a new process that could, over months, produce a peace framework with Ukraine at the table, then Alaska was the opening move, not the checkmate. Trump also tried to keep leverage by warning of future penalties and by consulting Zelensky right after the meeting. But critics say shifting away from a ceasefire gave Russia space to keep fighting. Supporters say a ceasefire without a bigger plan would only freeze the war in place and reward aggression. The truth is, both arguments have weight, and the battlefield will test which one proves right. To understand why there was no ceasefire, we need to look at the core disagreement. Ukraine and its European allies preferred a ceasefire first, then talks. Russia favored talking first, with the guns still firing, which keeps pressure on Kyiv. In Alaska, the US pivoted closer to Russia's sequencing by downplaying an immediate ceasefire. That is why media across the spectrum said Putin gained a narrative win, even without a signed deal. The war did not pause, instead, the conversation changed shape. What about concrete proposals? Reporting suggests that Russia pushed ideas that Kyiv has long rejected, such as recognizing full Russian control over occupied parts of eastern Ukraine in exchange for freezing the rest of the front. Nothing like that was agreed in Alaska. Trump publicly said that any deal must involve Ukraine's own elected president, Volodymyr Zelensky. After the summit, Zelensky agreed to travel to Washington for talks and even left open, at least in principle, the idea of a three-way meeting down the line. But for now, these are only intentions, no text exists. Let's briefly step back to the visuals again, because in diplomacy, the images are part of the message. The ceremonies, the military flyover, the choreographed greeting, all of that made the summit feel consequential. And then there was Lavrov's USSR sweatshirt. That was not a random fashion choice. It told Americans, Europeans, and Russians at home that Moscow remains defiant and comfortable weaponizing symbolism. In a summit many now call no ceasefire, only theater, wardrobe became messaging. When a foreign minister walks into a US city wearing the letters of the old Soviet Union, it is a reminder that Russia's information war marches right next to its diplomacy. Now, focus on the India-US trade track that moved in parallel. As Alaska unfolded, headlines described postponed US trade visits to Delhi and looming tariff hikes on Indian goods, with dates and percentages being reported and debated. India's position stayed steady: engage, talk, and protect national interests. The government's public line praised the pursuit of peace, welcomed the summit as a step toward diplomacy, and rejected unilateral pressure, especially tariffs linked to India's energy choices. For New Delhi, the message was that India decides its energy security policy, period. So where did Alaska really land? Most simply, the war continued, there was no ceasefire, no prisoners released, and no map changed. But a political shift did occur. The US leader moved the public conversation toward a long peace negotiation framework and away from a quick ceasefire. Putin gained time and an image boost. Ukraine stayed central, with Zelensky invited to Washington to shape the next steps. Europe signaled support for talks, but also warned that sanctions must tighten if Moscow uses the process to stall. The path forward is now a long road with many forks, not a sprint to a truce. Let me be very clear about one point: the title "No Ceasefire, Only Theater" sounds harsh, but it captures a real criticism. Many observers said the summit served the optics more than the outcomes. They pointed to Putin's confident posture, the lack of immediate consequences for continued fighting, and the symbolic trolling by Russian officials. Yet others argued that even a stage without a deal can be useful if it opens doors. Negotiations often begin with optics, gestures, and vague language before moving to hard text. Which view is right? We will know only if the next meetings produce actual terms. For India, here are the takeaways in plain language. First, India's diplomacy is consistent: support peace through dialogue. Talk to everyone, and do not accept unilateral pressure that harms national interests. Second, India will buy energy where it finds best value. This keeps inflation under control and industry moving. Third, New Delhi wants an early, just end to the war, but not at the cost of strategic autonomy. This position was restated during and after the Alaska weekend. In short, India's message to Washington and Moscow was, "We welcome your talks, we want peace, but we will not be pushed." What should we watch next? Watch whether the planned Trump-Zelensky meeting in Washington produces a shared roadmap. Watch if any trilateral format with Putin is even possible while fighting continues. Watch Europe's patience with open-ended talks. If the front lines heat up, pressure for more sanctions will rise quickly. Watch China, too. If secondary sanctions are applied, global energy and shipping markets will feel it. And watch India-US trade dynamics. Tariff deadlines and negotiation calendars will be real stress tests for both economies. Now, let's tie each of the requested themes into one clear narrative arc. The summit's core outcome was not a ceasefire, but a repositioning of the US approach toward a longer peace negotiation. Russia's intention was to avoid immediate pressure, gain legitimacy, and keep the military clock running. Lavrov's sweatshirt was a deliberate theatrical signal of defiance and nostalgia, fitting Russia's broader information strategy. Trump's pre-meeting threats toward India over tariffs and oil were an attempt to reshape the geopolitics around Russia, squeezing Moscow by targeting its partners, but India's response was strong: support talks, defend energy security, and reject unfair pressure. In the end, the Alaska stage was big, the sound was loud, but the script delivered no ceasefire. Whether it was only theater depends on what the next acts bring. As we close, remember this timeline. Before Alaska, Trump talked tough, including on trade and sanctions, and claimed Russia had already lost India as a client. In Alaska, the leaders met for hours, spoke of peace, but announced no ceasefire. After Alaska, Trump called Zelensky and promised more talks in Washington. Through it all, India kept its line: diplomacy, dialogue, national interest, and energy security. That is the complete picture, from start to finish, in simple terms. The war did not stop, but the conversation changed. If the coming meetings put real terms on paper, security guarantees for Ukraine, withdrawal steps, verification, and a just peace, then Alaska will be remembered as the opening scene, not the final act. If not, the critics will say the title was right: no ceasefire, only theater.